All right, here we are for part 2, and it's only been a few minutes for me since I recorded part 1. But hey, it may have been days since you watched part 1. So I want to make sure that you don't forget that stuff at the beginning of part 1. That may have been lost, all of that stuff about big ideas. I'm around. I want to help. Fun never ends unless you let it. Did I get into a fragile ego as a serious learning disability? Maybe I didn't even mention that one. That's an important one too. Right? You don't want to shy away from discussing things because it'll make you feel foolish, or maybe other people will be watching and they'll think you're foolish. You're not going to get very far in life if you worry about that. Sure, it's better to learn from other people's mistakes than your own, but there's going to be plenty of yours to learn from. So make sure you give yourself that chance to do that, especially if the cost of those mistakes is low, as it invariably is at the beginning of an economics course, where you do a lot of exercises at first that don't have any direct impact on your grade, but have an indirect impact. Because if you don't do those, then the ones that do have an effect, graded homework first and then the exams, then those don't turn out so well. All right, so in that part 1, which you may have watched days ago or just minutes ago, we left off with number 7 being about similar to number 2, and so I didn't make any additional remarks about institutions under that. So now we're ready to go on to number 8. And one of the reasons that I drew the dividing line between part 1 and 2 where I did was because some of these remaining big ideas are sort of macro-ish, more than micro-ish. But, and this, of course, this course is microeconomics. But you need to appreciate the big picture, at least for a few minutes, to have just sort of an overview of the overview before you get into the little pieces to kind of understand where they fit in. So that's how I view this first part. And then we're going to go to one of the other pages that I have here to look at a graph to illustrate how you need to look at all graphs. You do not want to memorize these little things with sticks and lines and ultimately triangles, and you don't want to do that. That directly violates the fun never ends unless you let it. You're letting it. Okay? Now, admittedly, you might want to be doing other things that are even more fun than studying an economics graph. But, that's not always an option, and you have to think in terms of long-run fun, being a more successful professional versus long-run fun. You'd rather be out in the sunshine. Maybe not. It's August still when you're probably watching this. But anyway, you might want to be somewhere else other than watching a video or attending an excellent economics lecture. So the last thing that we're going to do in this part 2 overview is to look at a graph, not to look at it per se, although that's helpful, but to think in terms of how all graphs need to be looked at so that when you finish studying, you actually do get to duh. And remember, that's how you know whether you've studied and studied enough, is you've gotten through the painful elaboration of the obvious, and now it's obvious. Maybe that's too strong a term. You're getting it. You understand it. You have an intuitive sense of, yeah, if we do that, that ought to happen most of the time. Or if this changes, then that ought to change. This should cause this. See, then you're sort of understanding it rather than saying, well, Doc said if this happens, okay, I'll memorize that. No, don't do that. Please don't do that. You may be able to fool enough of the questions enough of the time to pass the course to do that. But things come home to roost. Eventually you'll need that knowledge to be out there, and someone will have it and you won't. They'll get ahead and you won't. Sorry. And by the way, it turns out that people with some economics background are among the most highly paid people. So I have not just hope underlying what I just said. I have experience and data. If you have a better grasp of economics, you're going to be a better engineer, a lot of things, than if you've never taken an economics course or you just memorized your way through it and learned a little bit, and the rest of it you forgot 5 minutes after the final exam. All right, so number 8 on our list of big ideas in economics is that the macroeconomy undergoes, that's kind of Canadian accent, undergoes booms and busts. In other words, it grows faster for a while and slower for a while. Sometimes when it goes slower for a while, it goes all the way to negative. Remember 2009? My golly, some of you are still high school or even less than that. That's scary, given how old I am already. But anyway, Remember 09, 08? Things were rough in a lot of places then, and that's because the economy went from growing pretty well in 2005 and 6 and 7 to growing not at all in a lot of places, and in negative growth, as we say, backsliding in a lot of other places. Not so good. Because we don't like ups and downs, sometimes we're willing to sacrifice, if we can achieve that through policy, faster growth in the booms for faster growth in the slower time periods, right? Moderating the busts a little bit. We're willing to pay having less dynamic booms to do that if we possibly can. So we're tempted sometimes to use policies, mostly changing the money supply or the federal government changing taxes or spending, to try to get the economy to quickly grow faster, sometimes slower, but mostly faster than it already is, hopefully before it starts growing faster on its own. See, and therein lies the temptation, or the reason that it's a temptation that we should resist, is because we may badly conceive the problem, we may misdiagnose it, or by the time we get around to actually implementing a redress to try to get it to grow faster, it may already be growing faster. It may have already on its own leave the bust part of the ups and downs, and then we may make a fast growth even faster with its own down consequences. Kind of like if we step on the gas pedal going downhill, we may lose control, and it may start going too fast, and then we may have problems, a different set of problems, a little too much optimism, a bubble that may burst, if you've heard that term. All right, number 9 on our list. It's sort of macroeconomic, but introduces us to a fundamental aspect of the microeconomy, namely, we need trade. We need trade. I don't use that N word lightly. You'll discover that need is the N word, a 4-letter word in economics. Most of the time we'd rather have people use the word want, because the word need overstates the issue. But in this case, we need the government to provide a currency, money, okay, a way to buy things without having to trade goods for goods, or services for goods, or services for services. Barter is a disaster. We want to avoid that. It would be very, very difficult to consummate much trade if we couldn't do it indirectly through money. Okay, so once we need money to avoid barter, to consummate trade, see, trade, we don't have that, we can't specialize in what we're best in. We all have to be kind of self-sufficient, because we can't do much trade, and wow, we'd all be poor if we all had to produce most of the things that we consume for ourselves. Okay, so money is a big deal, and once money becomes a big deal, by that I mean not just having some, but I mean for the economy, having enough in circulation is a big deal, but it's not obvious how much too much is, or how much too little is. We know that at some point, if we print too much money, if we put too much in circulation, we, being the government in this case, that we're going to get price inflation, which is not good, is to change how much we can buy with a given amount of money. That creates all kinds of issues, uncertainties, and problems that bring the economy down eventually, although at first the ride may seem kind of pleasant, especially if your income is growing a little faster than the average rate of increase. Might even seem good for a while. But we want to avoid inflation, so in recognizing that we need money to foster trade, to avoid barter, we need to know how much the right amount is, and somehow that seems to have changed in the last few years. The last few years have made me glad that I'm not a macroeconomist in my ways of earning a living. I've taught macroeconomic principles. I'm glad I'm not now. And I'm more comfortable teaching microeconomics in part because the last few years we doubled and tripled the amount of money in circulation. And there wasn't, or at least there hasn't been any yet, across-the-board price inflation. So I'm kind of scratching my head. It's like, what happened? The amount of money, that's the right amount of money that the economy will tolerate without price inflation, will support exchange, specialization, seems to have grown quite a bit, and I don't know why. I have some ideas why, but I don't know for sure why that is. Anyway, money is absolutely essential to foster specialization in being in the things that firms and individual people are best at. But we're not as sure as we used to be how much the right amount of money is and whether we need to increase it at any given point in time or whether we've already got the right amount and we better not increase it. As you know, if you keep up with the news at all, you know a lot of places in the world have produced too much money. They put too much money in circulation. And they've got massive price inflation, and their economy's gone in the tank as a result. So far, we've resisted that temptation, or at least that outcome, and hopefully we'll continue to do so, which highlights big idea number 10, is that central banking is a hard job. Central banks, which in the United States is the Federal Reserve System, have a tough job, especially now that they've been asked to do more than just focus on how much money should be kept in circulation and then keep that amount of money in circulation. They've been asked to help fine-tune the macroeconomy to ameliorate the ups and downs, and it's hard to have two goals with only one tool. So anyway, central banking is a tough job, but somebody's got to do it because there isn't any alternative to having some reliable, limited source, but not too limited source of cash and other immediately liquid ways of paying for things and not having to rely on barter. The 11th big idea in economics, I've added it myself, you won't find this in the book, is that it's very important that we have a diversity of talent and passion for doing different things. And we're not all the same, and we like different things, and we're better at different things. That's that passion and diversity. And that's important, and it's important that we harness it because otherwise it's going to be tough to get a lot of things done. Look around you on any given day or minute and think of all the jobs you are very relieved you are not doing, but you're very relieved that somebody else is. Well, see, we achieve that in our economy by recognizing the importance of diversity in talent and passion. Okay? So we educate people to do different things. And we facilitate that because we have trade so that when you produce a lot of something, you can trade most of it for all the other things you want. So we have cash and checkable deposits facilitated by our central bank, the Federal Reserve, as a way to have indirect trade. And therefore, we can specialize in things, and by golly, we better for our individual happiness and for the economy's productivity. Let me just throw out an example that I hope it doesn't make you mad, but it will make you think about things. This is a touchy example. I've thought about this. This is an example of why people need to be able to think about things without labeling people in certain ways and assuming that they've formed even an opinion about them, certain things, just because they throw it out as an issue. Here it is. I had this thought many years ago when I heard some women on the radio. I lived in Hawaii at the time. Now you're thinking, I thought this guy was kind of nuts. Why did he leave Hawaii for Texas? I can get into that another time. You're lucky that you can take a vacation in Hawaii, that's one of our 50 states. But probably you want to live in Texas. Maybe not one of the other lower 47, but certainly Texas. All right, so what was going on there in Hawaii several years ago that made me think of this example that I want to propose to you as a way of thinking about why we should have impersonal markets. Markets aren't people. They're just a balancing result, keeping supply and demand equal in the short run. As you know, rationing out is available in the short run. And that produces results sometimes we don't agree with for maybe good reasons. And the question is, what should we just tolerate them because the consequences are worse by not tolerating them, or should we risk tampering with them? Anyway, here's the example. These women in Hawaii were talking about hiring nurses. Okay? Nurses tends to be a profession dominated by women. But here's the thing that at the time knocked my socks off. They said we prefer hiring men. Okay? Now, I didn't say they paid men more. I don't know whether they put that in action. But in the long run, if that's a widespread feeling, if many firms, for whatever reason, whether it's just pure discrimination or actual meaningful differences between men and women in producing certain things, either way, if there's a preference, whether it's guided by prejudice or actual productivity difference, is going to ultimately yield differences in average wages. So, women are obviously not on the prejudice side. They're not prejudiced against women. So what was going on there? Why did they prefer men over women, given that they are women? Well, it turns out that men are less likely to leave the labor force to have children and care for children once they're born. That creates that fact. It's not as much of a fact now as when I heard that. That was back in the mid-'80s. It was more of a fact then. But I think that's still true. That fact that women are more likely to enter the labor force and then leave for childbearing and child rearing is a factor in the back of the minds of people doing hiring, a risk in hiring a woman that doesn't exist with hiring a man, that changes the willingness to pay for men versus women. Now you might know that's not fair, and because maybe it's not fair. That's why economists focus on efficiency, because it's hard to put a handle on an objective definition of fair. But in an impersonal market, absent government intervention, that fact that there's somewhat less risk of labor force exit with men than with women is going to result in a higher willingness to pay by some people for men versus women. So, should that will yield in impersonal markets higher paychecks for men. Is that a reason to intervene via the government? That's unfair. We should have equal pay for equal work. Risk of labor force exit, even though firms value it, should not be allowed to be a factor in hiring somebody or in offering some with less risk more than others perceived to have more. By the way, it's proof that it's not that this outcome in the past certainly was for those women back in Hawaii hiring nurses. They didn't, if it was a single nurse, somebody not married, they didn't pay them any less than single men. The discrimination, if you want to call it that, was against the women applying to be nurses that had shiny new rings on their finger and said, I just got married and we're just about to start a family. That was, wait a minute, if I hire this person, spend all this money training them, they might quit on me pretty soon. If I hire this guy instead, that's not as likely to happen. Preference. Not fair, right? That somebody wants, is the part of the family unit that has the children physically and is more likely to care for them and leave work on a moment's notice if something happens to the kids than the male member. So anyway, there's something to toss out there as a way of thinking about markets assigning different prices to different things on an impersonal, entirely impersonal basis. Okay, nothing personal, less risk, more risk, we're willing to pay more for them. That may justify, and in some people does justify, government intervention in saying, that's just not fair. We need to not allow that process to work as it would in an impersonal, unregulated market. Okay, that serious issue aside, by the way, that's another reason to have this video. That might have caused a little rancor in a room full of people. Something, yeah, sure, I understand that. If it was me, that's how I'd behave. There are people saying, doggone it, that's not fair. We can't allow that. That's just plain old discrimination, paying more to men doing identical work to women just because the women are more likely to quit in the near future and the man isn't. So, maybe more videos more often to do controversy. Maybe we should talk about gun control and abortion later. I mean, those are political issues, right? Somebody somewhere's got to talk about them to figure out what to do. But boy, they're not easy to talk about, and if you talk about them in the wrong way, or race relations, whoa, talk about that being in there. There's another one. If you talk about that, that's a career-endangering thing. You might use the wrong words to describe things, or somebody might think you're making an assumption. Anyway, so there's a pet peeve of mine that it's difficult to talk about things. More difficult than it should be when certain things need to be talked about, and it needs to not be assumed that somebody is prejudiced or holds some kind of a grudge or is trying to guide people to certain conclusions, just trying to throw it out there to get people to talk about things. All right, so back to the beginning of, part one of this two-part series. The biggest idea of all is that economics is fun. Of course, it's not necessarily fun, and some parts of it are more fun than others. But you can make it more fun if you decide that it is. One of the reasons that you can decide to make it more fun is that the more people understand economics, and really do, the better the world is that we'll live in, because people will make better choices for themselves, and they'll make better choices when they go to the polls. They won't vote for somebody that they wish later they hadn't voted for based on, whoops, I didn't know the world worked that way. I didn't know that that promise that they wanted to keep was one that they shouldn't have promised and wish they hadn't promised. And I sure wish they hadn't promised it. All right, so I'll leave it there and move on to the final aspect and element of this part two of this introduction and overview by flipping over to a couple of things. Whoops. Let me go back here because I don't want you to be distracted by looking at two graphs at the same time. So let me flip over. Here it is. Oops, going to cover the second one. I'm going to talk about the second one, but I want you to stay totally focused on the first one first. And most of your graphs will have an XY axis on it. It'll be relating to things. This is an unusual case, but hey, I'm the big picture doc. That's actually one of my email addresses. And so I want to present the big picture and show how microeconomics fits in with this macroeconomic overview. All right, so microeconomics looks at the behavior of households and the behavior of business firms, and sometimes it's applied to look at the behavior of the government. Okay, there are two kinds of markets, ones in which resources are sold, like land, labor, and capital. There are the other kind of markets is product markets, where goods and services are sold. Households earn money, are sellers in resource markets. Okay, hence the dollar flow this way. And well, they're not going to get all the money that comes out of the business firms, because some of it's going to leak out as income tax. Of course, some of it will come back in the same way, because some people have their employment not by business firms but by the government. Then households have their disposable income after taxes, and some of that's going to go into savings. Okay, and some of that will come back into the product markets via the purchases made by those who borrow those savings to make investments. And also the government will be using its money from income taxes and taxes on consumption taxes, to pay government employees and to purchase goods and services. So, two kinds of markets, two or three participants. What's going on in the microeconomy or the micro view? Households are trying to maximize their share of this and get as much as possible in terms of satisfaction from their participation in product markets. Firms are trying to get as much as they can out of the money that's flowing through product markets by producing the most highly valued products relative to their production cost, make profit. And they are and they're trying to purchase the resources that they need. Yeah, you need some resources to make products that they need to make their products as cheaply as possible. So they're trying to spend as little as possible to make as much as possible from this market. Okay, so there's your big picture view of that. And the microeconomic part of that general overview. Last but not least in this overview of microeconomics is a brief lesson in what you need to do. I'm using the N word a lot today. I'm not going to use it too much more this semester, but I'm trying to get you to approach this in the most productive way possible. So these are definitely needs. All right, so quite often we draw graphs to model the relationship between the things on the x-axis and the things on the y-axis. Okay, in this case, we want to model the issue of scarcity. Okay, and so one of the ways of doing that is by drawing a production possibilities frontier. That's what this line is. As the word frontier implies, it depicts the limit on how much we can produce with existing resources and current technologies. Okay, so for example, if you allow me to run off the screen for a minute to get a pen, it means that, and let me use the existing numbers on here. Never mind that point. Let's call this point G. It is not possible to produce 120 units of defense while also producing 180 units of all other goods. Okay, AOG for all other goods. It is beyond our current abilities, so therefore it is a point beyond the frontier. Okay, I'll try to look up every once in a while rather than talking to my graph. But I do have to look at what I'm pointing at. All right, so what you need to do with all graphs is to think about shapes. It's bulging outward. It's sloping downward. Okay, and starting points and what they mean. Okay, so what does this one mean? This says that one production possibility is 120 units of defense, and try to cope with the abstractness of it. What you're saying, what's 120 units of defense? Go with it. Just assume that it's some homogeneous commodity. And yeah, that's a challenge sometimes. Okay, so one of the production possibilities, point C, is 120 units of defense, but nothing else. 0 all other goods. Okay, so that means if we allocate all of our resources with the best possible technology, achieve technical efficiency, we'll produce 120 units of defense, and that's it. Okay, so that's what our starting point says. The end point, going left to right, point E is the end point. Another production possibility is to produce only all other goods, produce no defense, to be defenseless. All right, that means ready to be invaded by some hostile foreign entity. Okay, we could produce a lot of all other goods if we were willing to risk being defenseless, 300 units. All right, that's an extreme possibility there. And the fact that there's a downward sloping line between the two of them means that the production possibility for defense declines as we endeavor to produce more of all other goods. But it doesn't decline at a constant rate. That's what the curved line says. And it depicts reality, which is why we draw it this way. It's a model based on what we've learned by studying reality. Okay, we've learned that there are opportunity costs once you achieve scarcity. For example, if you start at point B, you could go to point A, and because you weren't at an efficient point, there are no opportunity costs. You could, by being more efficient, have more defense without having any less of all other goods. But once you're at C, A, E, or any other point on the production possibility frontier, the only way you can have more of either of these is to move along the frontier and thus tolerate having less of the other one. And that is the measure of opportunity cost. To go from 0 all other goods to 180 units of all other goods forgoes 120 minus 90, 30 units of defense. Now we can only produce 90 units of defense if we endeavor to produce 180 units of all other goods. Right? We'll have to be technically efficient to achieve 90 units of defense while producing 180 units of all other goods. All right, so again, to review, you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? Oh, we're talking about our ability to produce defense and all other goods. If we produce just defense, that's how much. If we produce just all other goods, that's how much. all the in-between choices where we produce some of each, if we achieve technical efficiency, is one of these points on the graph, not just the labeled ones, all of the points on it. How do we choose which one? How do we achieve what we hope is allocative efficiency, the best combination of our two possibilities? Well, we do marginal analysis. Remember, that's where we go one step at a time and ask ourselves if the gain was worth the cost. Okay? To make it a little easier for purposes of this graph, for instance, we would ask if the movement from C to A, that's a big change, which costs 90, 120 minus 90, 30 units of defense, if that was something we were willing to give up to achieve 180 units of all other goods. Maybe we were, maybe we weren't. Depends on the circumstances. If there's suddenly an external threat and we're here at A, maybe we would say, oops, maybe we should move a little bit further back to point C, but maybe not all the way, maybe to there. Okay, so we're constantly doing marginal analysis, evaluating whether more of the one would be worth less, having less than the other. Once we put numbers on here, we can talk about opportunity cost in real numbers. For example, we can say that to produce another 120 units of all other goods, starting at point A, we'd have to give up 90 units of defense and leave ourselves defenseless. Probably we would decide that that big of a jump was not worth the cost to be defenseless, but maybe we would be willing to be here. Maybe the world's looking pretty safe and it doesn't look like we need to produce a whole lot of defense, less than we had been producing. All right, so these same things you have to do exactly with all the other graphs. Let me just quickly go to one of the others back here on this first page. So if you're looking at this model, you would ask what point A says. Well, it says that the most anybody would be willing to pay for this good is this dollar amount. I know there's no number there, but if we put a number there, currently they're able to buy it at this price. They're pretty happy. They would be willing to pay that. They only have to pay that. Okay, B says that's the minimum amount that it takes anybody to spend in order to produce a unit of this good, and then it goes higher from there. Okay, this point down here that I didn't label says if we gave it away, that's how many people would take. Okay, gave it away in terms of money. Remember, even if there's a zero money cost, there may be still other opportunity costs, handling, storage, etc. I'm not going to talk about Q wrong, it says there. I will later in the semester, but not here. So that wraps it up. We're done with the intro overview, and I might have taken between the two halves a little more than an hour and 15 minutes, but we can catch up with that or have some serendipity out of it. More than you paid for. I know, more than you normally have to study, but more than you paid for out of it. You know, that's one of the interesting things about a college education. If you voluntarily talk longer than you have to, people will get mad. I know in most cases, well, you got to go off to another class and you're being held responsible for what they're saying. But it is bizarre, even so, because it seems like the only market in which people want as little as possible for their money. Yeah, they want the prestige of having gotten a degree from a esteemed university, but they want to put in as little work as possible in getting there. Anyway, at your service, we'll move on from here, mostly in. All right, here we are for part 2, and it's only been a few minutes for me since I recorded part 1, but hey, it may have been days since you watched part 1, so I want to make sure that you don't forget that stuff at the beginning of part 1 that may have been lost, all of that stuff about big ideas. I'm around. I want to help. Fun never ends unless you let it. Did I get into a fragile ego as a serious learning disability? Maybe I didn't even mention that one. That's an important one too. Right? You don't want to shy away from discussing things because it'll make you feel foolish, or maybe other people will be watching and they'll think you're foolish. You're not going to get very far in life if you worry about that. Sure, it's better to learn from other people's mistakes than your own, but you know, there's going to be plenty of yours to learn from, so make sure you give yourself that chance to do that, especially if the cost of those mistakes is low. Before you get into the little pieces to kind of understand where they fit in. So that's how I view this first part, and then we're going to go to one of the other pages that I have here to look at a graph to illustrate how you need to look at all graphs. You do not want to memorize these little things with sticks and lines and ultimately triangles. And you don't want to do that. That directly violates the fun never ends unless you let it. You're letting it. Okay, now admittedly, you might want to be doing other things that are even more fun than studying an economics graph. But, that's not always an option, and you have to think in terms of long-run fun, being a more successful professional versus long-run fun. You'd rather be out in the sunshine. Maybe not. It's August still when you're probably watching this. But anyway, you might want to be somewhere else other than watching a video or attending an economics lecture. So the last thing that we're going to do in this Part 2 overview, get ahead and you won't. Sorry. And by the way, it turns out that people with some economics background are among the most highly paid people. So I have not just hope underlying what I just said. I have experience and data. If you have a better grasp of economics, you're going to be a better engineer, a lot of things, than if you've never taken an economics course or you just memorized your way through it and learned a little bit, and the rest of it you forgot 5 minutes after the final exam. All right, so number 8 on our list of big ideas in economics is that the macroeconomy undergoes, that's kind of Canadian accent, undergoes booms and busts. In other words, it grows faster for a while and slower for a while. Sometimes when it goes slower for a while, it goes all the way to negative. Remember 2009? My golly, some of you are still high school or even less than that. That's scary, given how old I am already. But anyway, remember 2009, 2008? Things were low, as it invariably is at the beginning of an economics course, where you do a lot of exercises at first that don't have any direct impact on your grade, but have an indirect impact. Because if you don't do those, then the ones that do have an effect, graded homework first and then the exams, then those don't turn out so well. All right, so in that Part 1, which you may have watched days ago or just minutes ago, we left off with number 7 being about similar to number 2, and so I didn't make any additional remarks about institutions under that. So now we're ready to go on to number 8. And one of the reasons that I drew the dividing line between Part 1 and 2 where I did was because some of these remaining big ideas are sort of macro-ish, more than micro-ish. But, and this, of course, this course is microeconomics. But you need to appreciate the big picture, at least for a few minutes. To have just sort of an overview of the overview is to look at a graph, not to look at it per se, although that's helpful, but to think in terms of how all graphs need to be looked at so that when you finish studying, you actually do get to duh. And remember, that's how you know whether you've studied and studied enough, is you've gotten through the painful elaboration of the obvious, and now it's obvious. Maybe that's too strong a term. You're getting it. You understand it. You have an intuitive sense of, yeah, if we do that, that ought to happen most of the time. Or if this changes, then that ought to change. This should cause this. See, then you're sort of understanding it rather than saying, well, Doc said if this happens, okay, I'll memorize that. No, don't do that. Please don't do that. You may be able to fool enough of the questions enough of the time to pass the course to do that. But things come home to roost. Eventually you'll need that knowledge to be out there, and someone will have it and you won't.